a lot of companies and organizations, interpersonal management, human connection, and leadership is going to go way farther. People never want to be a number. They never want to be lost in red tape. They never want to feel like no one knows them or their story. The only thing you receive as a speaker or a storyteller is cheerleading or criticism. But the middle is a coach. If you have a moment from your life and you don't know how to ascribe value to it, you don't know how to give it a word, that might be an area you need some healing.
So often when you think of either as a speaker or as a leader, I'm trying to talk to a lot of people is, oh, well, I have to be broad.
Yeah.
And what you said by that is no, be very, very specific because people can actually relate to that. Tell us more about it. As we're standing here, I want to apologize for yesterday. That was my error on not being properly mic'd up. So I really apologize for those of you that weren't able to properly hear. I screwed that up, so please forgive me. But we're going to be better today, right?
Always.
Okay. I love you.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I say that because, man, as we got into this process of creating this event,
yeah,
and I can sit here and say that all the people are here not because of me, but because of either it was on purpose,
yeah,
or because of a higher power than me. But I love how everything goes together. And when I say I love you, I appreciate what you bring and as you help leaders.
Yeah. And
you do it with such a sweet, nurturous heart and understand that stories matter.
Yeah.
So I wanted to say that.
I appreciate that.
One thing that I took away, and I got a lot of notes. I don't know if we have time for this. I want to ask everyone there, did you get value from this? Okay, good. I just want to make sure that I'm not the only one. If I'm the only one, I'm still cool with it because I'm the one that paid for you to be here, but that's okay. They paid for you to be here. Let's be honest.
Yeah.
Okay. One of the things that you mentioned that I want to start with is stories are more valuable than stuff. That's a real central point to your life.
Yeah.
Where do you see individuals, leaders, just people? Because so often leaders think that, oh, I'm different, or people think that leaders are different. The reality is they're still people.
Totally.
Where do they get stuck there?
Yeah. I work with some organizations and they do try to throw specific bonuses, incentives, swag at people and say, don't you like your job? I got you this hoodie. Do you know what I mean? And people are like, what? And there's such a lack of human connection there that sometimes stuff obviously is needed. People want raises and people want to be paid a fair living wage. There's all these pieces to the puzzle financially that matter. But I think for a lot of companies and organizations, interpersonal management, human connection, and leadership is going to go way farther than the random thing you want to purchase them or their random free dinner. It's going to be caring about them and listening to them and sharing your story and you hearing theirs. And we know that human connection and relationship is what lasts and it's what creates retention in businesses. It's what creates relational connection. So I think in the business space, it translates across the board because for so many of us, we just think we want more things, especially at night in our Amazon cart. And then what we actually want is to live a better story. And we think that thing's going to give us that, and it doesn't.
That brings up so many additional thoughts.
Yeah. I went on a little side rant there.
It's good. You added plenty of context there because the conflict is really now coming out.
Right.
The one thing that I see there, and we can talk about why people struggle.
Yeah.
It's a lot easier to send somebody a vest that says brand, impact-driven leader, right? Mm-hmm. And thankfully I have a friend, John Ruland's like, don't ever do that. That's all about you, not them. And you're showing it's all about me, not them.
Yeah.
But leaders default to that because it's way easier.
Yeah.
If I have 3,000 people that I need to, care for in my organization, we'll send them a mug. We'll send them a branded this or that. Yeah. Man, it's hard to connect with them. Yeah. But as you're saying, really, whatever you send them is irrelevant. Call them, text them, write them a letter, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think there's always, I've gotten some really cool swag from some companies. So I just want, sometimes I like a cool Patagonia jacket. I'm like, oh my gosh, thank you. There is some cool moments where you can get some sweet things. I'm not just missing it altogether. Okay. But that always has to be matched. That human connection. People never want to be a number. They never want to be lost in red tape. They never want to feel like no one knows them or their story. And that is really tricky, especially when we're in an environment where people work virtually. So people log in to Microsoft Teams and see someone, and they don't even know where they live, what time it is where they are. So that person just totally feels like a cog in the machine. So how you create short story sharing in those environments is really valuable for leaders, especially because what you don't want is for an hour-long meeting to just be people sharing about their traumatic experience, and you're like, was this okay? There's the pendulum swings both ways, but making people feel really known is highly valuable.
Well, I think that ties into one of the other things that you mentioned is the more specific, the more connecting. And I love that because so often when you think of either as a speaker or as a leader, I'm trying to talk to a lot of people is, I have to be broad. Yeah. And what you said by that is no. Be very, very specific because people can actually relate to that. Tell us more about it.
Yeah, I mean, anytime we connect to our own human experience, like you talking about you as a father or you as a husband or you and what you've overcame or you where you live, these kind of hyper-specific things paint a way better picture for me than for you to say, I got my degree in blank, I did this thing. That's not that narrative isn't compelling to me, and I don't think about myself in it. I mean, I maybe mentioned this in the session, but I'm not sure, but the goal of good storytelling is that people just think about themselves, right? That's what's wild. Really good storytellers, while they're talking, you're like, oh my gosh, my dad, right? Or they're thinking about their thing. So the sooner you can get someone from your thing to their thing, the better.
Hey there, this is Tyler, and I wanted to take a moment away from the conversation. You're listening to a brief interview I made at the Impact Driven Leader Summit 2024. If you want to hear more from this guest as well as others, you can access the full event by visiting theimpactdrivenleadersummit.com. As well, you'll be able to reserve your spot to attend the Impact Driven Leader Summit 2025, May 7th and 8th in Spokane, Washington. All right, now back to the conversation. As I think about that, and I want to know from you, I want to know this personally from you, is where did you have to overcome that a bit? Meaning that, I think part of you teaching it means I had to go through it and understand the value of it. I share for me, I grew up on a farm. Yeah. I grew up in a time in a world where farmers were mocked. Yeah. And it wasn't like our society. It wasn't like Yellowstone society right now. It was like if you came to school and you even looked like a little bit of a farmer, then you were kicked down, you are worthless to us. Yeah. That's what I grew up in. Yeah. And what's interesting is talking to people that grow up in that same type of community, society, same age. That's how we all felt. Yeah. And so now this world where everyone wants to know what it's like to have cows on 10 acres in the South Hill of Spokane, I'm like, you want to know? Because I've gotten laughed at all my life. Yeah. But what I understand is people want to know it. Yeah. That's me sharing. Yeah. I would love you to share. Yeah. Well, I mean, just to go back to that for a second, I think that's a perfect example of how we all have different stories that we tell ourselves about experiences that other people have. Because when you were like, oh, I grew up on a farm, and we were joking about this. I'm like, oh, and I grew up in Orange County, California. Really cool people grew up on farms. People, you know what I mean? Who is really rich? People who have land. Do you know what I mean? I'm like, who is fancy? People who can homeschool their children with raw milk. I'm like, so you're talking about how you had this rural upbringing, and I'm like, you know how cool it is that I have a backyard? That's a big deal where I live. Do you know what I mean? The reason I live in 900 square feet is so we could have a big yard. That was a value to us. And big yard is in air quotes, right? In this room, you'd say, sorry, what? Is there a fence? Yes, right? I can see both neighbors. So we have such different experiences in how we process things, and it's so important for you to share that story to say no, my childhood was mocked. I grew up in a rural environment where I was not respected. That is such important context because the story I'm telling myself about a kid who grows up on a farm is look at these magical, he could run free until he couldn't see the house anymore, where there's all these different stories each of us are telling ourselves. Yeah. I grew up with a really good storytelling dad. He's here in Coeur d'Alene. If you see me with him tonight at dinner, he's great. But he's just he's a classic boat guy. You know how people have boats tell the most stories? But he just, at the gas station, there's a guy and he just is oh yeah, I used to have that truck in 1984. And I'm like, Dad, get in the car. You know what I mean? If you tell one more person a story. So I just had a lot of storytellers in my life who were really effective. I think that was really helpful. And then
I worked in nonprofit spaces where people gave me very, very clear feedback as a speaker. And I think we've talked about this a little bit, but the thing that's missing in storytelling and speaking, Adam Grant has a great quote that says, the only thing you receive as a speaker or a storyteller is cheerleading or criticism, but the middle is a coach. And actually having someone who gives you clear feedback, right? Like I was 19 the first time someone said, Katie, you talk so fast that I'm having a heart attack, right? While you're talking. And I still do talk insanely fast, right? But I'm actually slower than teenage Katie, right? So how we kind of can process those things and say like, okay, how do I take a deep breath? What does feedback sound like? How do I kind of look into that? So I grew up in kind of a story-centric environment, but yeah, there was lots of things I had to overcome in my own journey and lots of spaces and places where I had to leave. I left the church after working in the church for 10 years. I have had journeys and seasons where, I left working in the church. And, there was a lot that we had to overcome. We thought our life was going to look completely different. We lived in an RV. We've traveled. Like, there was so many seasons that really took different turns than we expected.
When we spoke, I think it was on the previous podcast we did. And it was somewhere around in there. And you dropped just an absolute wisdom nugget that impacted me, and we discussed a little bit, and I even shared it with my daughter. I think I maybe sent this to you. She was crafting a story. Yeah. And you mentioned it today, and I want to go through it a little bit. Is scars, not wounds.
Yeah.
And so often I think it is kind of a little bit of context there. Is the story that's most relevant is the one that is currently open and we're dealing with. Yeah. The stories that were scars, we've kind of moved past them. We don't think they're relevant. Yeah. So kind of walk through that for, all of us to understand the piece and the dynamic of scars, not wounds.
Yeah. First and foremost, that's a Nadia Bolz-Weber quote, so I want to give her credit. She says, speak from scars and not from wounds. There is no way for me to decide when the right time is for you to tell your story. Only you can decide that. And that is a really tricky thing in coaching and consulting and in corporations where they're like, well, this really big thing happened and we need someone to tell this story right now. And it happened yesterday. And that's like, successful information sharing. That isn't yet storytelling. The story is still happening, right? Is anybody else currently living in a story that's still happening? You're like, I don't know the end. There is not a conclusion yet, right? And all of us find ourselves in those stories, but it is really important in the middle space to know how to restore along the way. But yeah, I think creating that healing for yourself, I talked about this a little bit in the session, but if you have a moment from your life and you don't know how to ascribe value to it, you don't know how to give it a word, that might be an area you need some healing. If you don't know how to say, I learned blank, or you don't know how to say, this is what happened to me, or I feel this about this thing, right? Like I have had seasons of my life where I'm like, I truly did not know how to talk about what was happening. Like I had a friendship fall apart. I had a random friend get famous. It was a very wild series of events where in real time, people were like, what do you think about this? And I would look at them and say, oh, I have no idea what I think about this. It's happening. Right, in real time. And all of these dynamics at play that made life so confusing, that story did deserve some space. And Great. I just gave it some space. I didn't need to be a professional in my own story as it's unfolding in front of me. And you don't need to be, right? Like, isn't there just so much pressure for you to have like organized every single thing that's ever happened in your life and written a book about it? But in real time, for a lot of us, we're like, I'm still sad. I'm still sad. And that's that. And you're allowed to share it like that.
Is that almost like kind of, you think about it, like being able to share, hey, this is what I'm going through, and I'm still going through it. That's a bit of a conclusion to say, I don't Absolutely. Have what I've learned. I Absolutely. Don't have that word, yes. But it's like, hey, I'm going through stuff.
Yes. And
I'm still going through it.
Yes. And I think our close relationships, our spouses, our best friends, our incredible community, the gift we actually get to give each other is that when you say that, I get to restory for you. So I get to say, Tyler, I just want you to know, I see you doing a really good job keeping your family together when things are hard. Like, Sarah, I see you deciding to go to work every day, even though you're depressed. That alone, saying, I see you, is restoring, right? Because when you're in the story, you need people around you to restore you. Like that's what healthy community does, is that when we don't know what's happening in our story, someone tells us. And that is a very important gift of leadership. Good leaders know how to do that, and it's very effective.
I'm smiling, if you can tell, because you just described what I would term as empathy.
Yeah.
That is I have a different definition of empathy. We'll talk about that later. It's
Yeah.
a tease. But that's what you described.
Yeah.
And it takes active work. And that's coming into someone's story.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. The last piece that you shared during your session, and I want to tap into because it's very prominent in our world today, especially as leaders. I'm busy. I'm going to just pass it off. Or the marketing department, which you talked about. Oh, we'll just give it to them. They'll come up with something. There's that little neat thing that we have today called AI, ChatGPT. And you said in a world, in our AI world, your human storytelling will be what makes the difference.
Yeah.
Man, how much of a reminder of that to people is human matters?
Yeah. Yeah, I think
that was my conclusion.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that exactly as you're saying that, one of the things that I talk about a lot as well is that the greatest stories are told not on stages, they're told at dinner tables. So when you can really think about yourself as an influencer, the reality is the people you are influencing the most are not people on the internet, even if you are an influencer, right? The people you are influencing the most are the people you're having dinner with. So the people that you have coffee with, the people that you go hang out with, the people you get drinks with, that's where actual human storytelling and influence matters. And that's where what we know statistically, that's where they actually change their mind, right? Isn't that what's crazy? People actually change their mind because they heard a human story at a table that changed them, right? So when we think about cutting through the noise of AI, and when we think about coming into that, I love what you just said, the marketing team will make that story perfect and this person will make that story perfect. But if you haven't thought about how you're talking about yourself at your dinner table with your kids, that's a different level of influence and one that's much more transformative in my book.
When you think about as this journey of helping people craft better stories and tell better stories and being a consultant, this is a leadership event. We're recording a leadership podcast. As we've talked about some things, we've talked personally about things of where leaders struggle so much in that whole dynamic of storytelling.
Yeah.
What's the one word? And you can give a little bit more flavor to it, but what's the word that you think really envelops where that struggle is?
Yeah, I think the struggle is found in the fact that people are comparing their stories to one another, first of all. They say, oh, my story's not as good as hers, so I won't share mine, which is so silly when you think about how many stories we really need and how many stories we need to hear in each area. So comparative storytelling is one of the things that stops us. Insecurity and lack of confidence is one of the things that stops us, obviously. And then the reality that a lot of us have a genuine core belief that our story just doesn't matter. That we're like, well, his is bitter and better and mine isn't this thing and I can't do that and I didn't go through a lot, so I don't have an amazing story like Tyler's. We say these kinds of things that we think we start to belittle our story more and more and more. And I just think that's it makes me sad. I'm like, oh wait, your unique perspective in the world and what you uniquely experienced is really valuable. And it can help someone in a way that neither one of us on this stage can. Fact, there are people in this room who can help people that we cannot help through our storytelling, through your storytelling. And I think that that's just a good reminder.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you for being here.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. This has been fantastic.
Absolutely. Thanks for spending time with me today. I want to invite you to hear even more from the Impact Driven Leader Summit. Click on the link in the notes or go to theimpactdrivenleadersummit.com to get full access to the video recording from this guest as well as all the others. At that website, you can also reserve your seat for Impact Driven Leader Summit 2025, May 7th and 8th in Spokane, Washington. Thanks for being here. Until next time, choose to lead with impact.